Hello my fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this week's competitive list analysis video. Before we get things started, I have a very special announcement to make. I have received a significant amount of messages on Reddit and YouTube asking for additional resources and my feedback on your lists. So I created a community Discord server for the channel where we can all collaborate and discuss with each other as the mighty kin would naturally do. To kick things off, I have a new initiative on the server where you could submit a finished picture of your painted Votann models to the Votann Pictures category, and every week I'll pull a couple of pictures from there with your credit and post it in each released video. So if you want to join in on the discussion, talk tactics and lists, and show us your models, join now using the exclusive link in the description below. On today's agenda, we'll be taking a look at the Clutch City GT held in Houston, Texas on the weekend of March 2nd to the 3rd, 2024. As always, we'll jump in to look at the Votann placings, examine some of the matchups, look at the scores, we'll conduct an in-depth list analysis, discuss some strengths and weaknesses of the list, and as always, contextualize the results of the placings by looking at some of the matchups. The list in today's episode was piloted by Corey Russell, who came 11th out of 154 players at the event, ending the weekend with 5 wins, 0 draws, and 1 loss. And it was a really close game to loss. So tragic. In terms of matchups, we have Game 1 with an 82-point victory to Necrons at 72. Game 2, we have Votann at 97 to Eldar at 78. Game 3 is 88-point victory against World Eaters at 79. Game 4 is Votann at 71 to Chaos Demons at 67. Votann 71 to Custos at 56 for Game 5. And then Game 6, finally, the defeat was 72 points to 1000 Suns at 75. A very close game. Actually, a fairly close game for each one of these matchups. Looking at the list, we can already see that this is one of the most aggressive damage-dealing Votann comps we've seen yet on the channel. Kicking things off, there's a Brokier Iron Master. No enhancements on this character, but he is leading a unit of 6-man Brokier Thunderkin, which, as we all know, are extremely effective damage dealers with their insane damage output into basically all profiles, whether they're vehicles for the anti-vehicle keyword or into some infantry with access to blast. They're an absolutely devastating unit to have and make up a strong force inside of a composition like this. I'm excited to look at these guys in a lot more detail when we release their unit analysis video, which is coming up soon. Next up, we have an Ironeer Champion, and the Ironeer Champion is running Grim Demeter with a Mass Hammer and Weaver Field Crest. So we're giving the Ironeer Champion here as much damage output as we can, while also taking Weaverfield to make him slightly more durable, which is always really good. So pretty standard take here. Now what's interesting is that the Ironeer Champion is actually going to be running with the 10-man Ironeer Hearthguard squad, the ones that are running plasmas. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's first talk about the next character, being the Cal. And this Cal is running an enhancement called a Long List. So a Long List, it's a pretty cute enhancement. It's nothing too crazy, but I've actually kind of grown to enjoy it in my own lists as well when I have the spare points to include it. You essentially get to pick another visible unit once you kill it, and if it had judgment tokens on it, the second unit that's visible to you gains 1 judgment token. It's pretty nice. It's a good way to build some tempo up in your list, especially if you're not going to be running Appraising Glare. Now at this point, we already see a very interesting and controversial pick. Instead of having the Cal run alongside the Ironeer Hearthguard squad, the 10-man with the plasma, we've actually included the Ironeer Champion and attached him to this unit instead. How do I know this? Well, I was very lucky. The pilot very generously made a thread on Reddit, inside the Leagues of Votann subreddit, where he explained the setup and configuration he ran for all of his games. So this time, I'm not speculating, I know this as a fact. So the Ironeer Champion's running alongside 10 Ironeer Hearthguard with plasmas and the concussion gauntlets. The Hessier is obviously going to be having the hammer. The hammer is just objectively better output than all other weapon options available to them, as we saw in our unit analysis video. And they have teleport crest, implying that this unit is always going to be in deep strike, which was the case. The Cal is going to be running alongside one of the 2 other 5-man Hearthguard units. And so these other 5-man Hearthguard units are each also equipped with gauntlets, and the Hessier is taking the hammer as well. We also see that the Hessier is also equipped with a teleport crest for both of these units, meaning that they have the option to go into deep strike, and we know from what the pilot shared with us online that this squad with the Cal did indeed go in deep strike. Now this is interesting because we typically would expect to see the Cal run alongside with the Plasma Hearthguard because it allows them to get slightly more damage that goes through the form of lethal hits. However, the trade-off is that once this unit does deep strike in, you are relying on making a 9-inch charge without having a baked-in reroll if you're not rapid ingressing the unit. The pilot confirmed that his goal was to basically bring the Iron Hearthguard down every game on his turn, so not rapid ingressing them because they just have too large of a footprint. And because of that, he needed to have better reliance on making a 9-inch charge. As a result of that, he included the Iron Champion with this unit instead, providing access to a native free reroll. Now, for those of you that remember watching my video on the Hearthguard analysis and how you should best equip them, you'll probably remember that the damage output from including a Cal with access to lethal hits versus having the Iron Champion do D3 to D6 damage on a charge is actually fairly comparable. And in a lot of ways, it's almost not even worth bringing the Cal for that, when the Iron Champion can more reliably provide you with some damage output instead, especially when there's only 10 shots being shot with your plasma guns on the Hearthguard squad. So in a lot of ways, it kind of makes a lot of sense to include an Iron Champion here. You also get more value out of Grim Demeanor because the Mass Hammer is absolutely massive and devastating if you're able to connect it to your opponent and get some of that damage to go through. The Cal is going to be running alongside that 5-man Hearthguard squad, and these guys have the Vulcanite Disintegrators, so no plasmas here. My first thought right off the bat with this is, if the decision was made to remove the Cal from the Hearthguard squad because priority was given to the ability to reroll your charges, I wonder if the damage output of having a Cal lethal hits attached to a 5-man squad outweighs simply having D3 extra damage on the charge. Because in theory, you have fewer shots going through with a 5-man, meaning you'll have fewer lethal hits that go through as well. It also takes away slightly from your dev wounds, as we saw with the math video. And I think because of that, you simply get more value out of just getting extra damage when you do connect a charge, and you have an easier time making that charge. So I'm not too sure on the inclusion of the Cal here. Maybe there is some value in simply having the Cal's innate ability to provide a free judgment token every round. That could be something that's helpful because here we aren't actually running a Praising Glare, so we are starved for some of that token generation if you think about it. But I'd be curious to hear what the pilot thinks about this and if this is one of the changes he'd be interested in making of removing the Cal, or if he felt the Cal was pivotal to maybe having a little bit more of that token economy going on and getting more value out of some of his units. I could see an interesting combo where the Cal comes down and provides a judgment token to someone, and then with a long list, now you're able to add a second judgment token if you kill another unit, and now suddenly there's one unit on 2 judgment tokens from 0 a turn ago. So that could be interesting, but I'm not sure how common it would be of an occurrence, and I'm just curious to hear the pilot's thoughts on it. I skipped over to Thunderkin. I touched upon them really quick, but the Brokir Thunderkin are all running Graviton Blast Cannons. It's the most flexible loadout. It's the most efficient loadout. You get a ton of damage that goes through against vehicles. You're pretty good into hordes as well, which is nice. And the pilot clarified that with the Brokir Ironmaster and Thunderkin, he always ran these out of reserve every game. So put them into reserve and then pop them out on the board. I've been experimenting with having them on the board, a 6-man squad with a Brokir Ironmaster, and I don't really like it. I'm struggling to use this unit effectively, and it is a tough unit to use because it's cheap, but at the same time, you know that it's key in doing a lot of damage, but you can't run too many of them, in my opinion anyway, because their range is too short, they're really slow, and positioning is absolutely critical to the success of this unit. So when I run them, I don't necessarily always get value out of having them on the board, and I was scared to put them into reserves because I feel like they could very easily be screened out. It seems like the pilot had great success with running his Thunderkin, and if he sees this video, I'd be curious to know how he felt they performed, or if there's a world where he could see them starting on the table instead. Back to the Hearthguard, you'll notice that there's also a third squad of 5 Iron Your Hearthguard included in this list, and now these guys have no leader attached to them, so they're significantly weaker. They're less durable because they lose access to -1 to be wounded, and we have seen something like this happen a couple of times before on the channel where lists do perform quite well with having a trading piece of Iron Your Hearthguard inside of a Hecaton Land Fortress without necessarily committing a character to them. I personally prefer having a character attached to them. It feels like I'm not getting enough points value out of the unit when I'm not having a character attached to them, simply because their survivability, their damage output, everything is magnified, which is quite nice. But I definitely see the idea as to what's going on here. It allows you to have something a bit more flexible in terms of trading when you compare it to Berserks, for example. Something a little bit more reliable as well, and scarier with range. But at the same time, you're limiting your investment in points, and you're strictly using this to trade. I will say, I'm not sure if this is an error with the list registration, but I see that this one is also running Teleport Crest as well. Maybe it's always just nice to have that baked-in flexibility, but the pilot said that he always ran it every game inside of the Land Fortress, this 5-man squad. In that case, it's probably just worth running the Weaver field so that one of your models has an invulnerable save. In terms of light infantry, we're running 10 Hearthkin warriors. These guys are pretty staple on every list. It allows you to fill your Sagittars, it allows you to score a little bit easier, and loadout isn't too important with these, but we do see the return of the staple high las inside the unit. I think this is critical to actually using these guys a little more effectively, because it allows you to advance and still perform and be eligible to perform secondaries, which is really good because it has assault as a keyword. He also elected to run a plasma beamer instead of a magna rail or some other option. Again, it doesn't matter too much. In my experience, these guys do 0 damage all game. They're just really here in the event that you need to pick up a wound off some chaff unit like cultists, or you're just trying to run around the board and score some secondaries somewhere and then die. We also have an inclusion of 5 Chthonian Berserks. It's a really solid trading piece. I mentioned this in my last unit analysis video. They're really good, a nice staple. We always see one of these run in every list. It's probably not essential, but they're really good. They're only 100 points, and as we saw, they could basically, with 2 Judgment tokens, kill half of a knight, which is pretty insane to think about it. In terms of transports and vehicles, we're looking at 3 Sagittars with a little bit of an interesting mix-up here. So we have 2 running a Hylas, and we have 1 running a missile launcher. I respect the decision to mix it up. I think that the missile launcher provides you with some of that stability, predictability when you're running this model, because at least you know if your shot goes through, you will always do X amount of damage. You'll always do 3, which is nice. However, I think Hylas is probably overall just a little bit better, because sometimes 3 just isn't enough. And yes, you might whiff, you might just get 1 that goes through, but on average, you'll probably get 3.5, and I feel like the potential to spike is much nicer when you run a Sagittar, because I've seen these things do absolute massive damage, even though they're a little swingy. But again, I understand the decision to include at least 1 with a missile launcher, just to have a little bit of flexibility between randomness and predictability if you know something needs to die with 3 wounds left. The next vehicle up is 1 Hecaton Land Fortress. I'm a big fan of Hecaton Land Fortress. I say this every time, and it's running the SP Conversion Beamer with Twin Bolt Cannon. This is the standard de facto loadout for this vehicle. It's an absolute monster in terms of durability. It's very hard to shift, surprisingly, and just really good primary presence. You bring this thing towards the center of the table, you park it on an objective, in this case with your 5-hour and your Hearthguard inside, ready to trade, ready to come out and protect it, or just contest some objective in the center of the table, and it's a very good threat. It's very effective and very strong. I love this platform. I usually run 2, but I've seen more recently a lot of lists are just running 1 instead. Last on the list, we have 2 squads of 3 Pioneers, and these guys are all running the Hylas rotary cannons with the scanner and the searchlight. We want to be able to ignore cover. It's very key to the success of their damage. Ignore cover is very powerful, super effective. But these guys are probably just going to be used in terms of secondaries every game, because you'll simply just bring them up and then pop them back down and hopefully try to score something across the table. They're really fast, they're really good at scoring, and they're okay with shooting. I know that there are some lists that are tending to run significantly more than 6 bikes now. There has been a slight shift in terms of what I've noticed, but I think that they still serve best as secondary scorers because of that utility that they have, and they're just 90 points. So what we get with this list is a really high amount of damage. The inclusion of a 6-man Thunderkin brick always leads to high shooting. You have not 1, not 2, but 3 squads of Hearthguard, 20 total in your list, which is a lot. It's a heavy investment in Hearthguard, but it comes with a lot of damage. That's the main benefit. So with this list, and confirmed by the pilot, the goal is to come down and just dominate your opponent in terms of killing output. You kill as much as you can and you dominate on primary. That's the main goal here. So as a second strength, it is excellent on primary because you have so many redundancies in terms of what you're planting on an objective. These very durable, high wound models that do a lot of damage. They want to be in the action. They want to be close to enemies anyway. You get them there. They'll pick everything up because of that built-in reliability and amplification of damage by popping sustained hits 2, for example, on your plasma squad, and the native rerolls you get to your dev wounds when you pop out of a hecaton, making for really solid trading pieces that dominate the board and stay there. There's some really good internal synergy as well, and my main point with that is talking about the Ioneer champion who's attached to the 10-man plasma brick. It's not something that we really see commonly used, but I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about it because the value of re-rolling your charge for free is so good. It allows you to pay 1 CP on a stratagem instead. You give the unit sustained hits too. You don't have to worry about making the charge or failing it because you get to re-roll it for free. So it's okay. I think that in itself provides a lot more value than lethal hits, particularly when it's just 10 shots that are going out. We saw in the video, it really doesn't equate to all that much more damage. And I think when you consider that the potential of getting mortal wounds on the charge because of the Ioneer champion and his extra damage with the mass hammer, it probably weighs more favorably in this selection instead. Like I said, the list is really tough, it's really strong in terms of output, and because of that, it's hard to deal with this. Yes, your opponent is obviously trying to kill you and also take primaries, but you've built a list that sort of exceeds at doing that. And so you want to be in a situation where your opponent is trying to fight you one-on-one, because this is where you do best. And I think there are a lot of situations, which we'll look at in the matchup section soon, where this list shines. Now that said, there are some weaknesses, and I think a very clear one is that it's kind of poor at scoring secondaries. There are fewer tech pieces in this list designed to go around the board doing objectives, designed to go around and score you things. Really, you're just focused on killing and controlling the middle of the table and controlling the primary objectives. Because of that, if you get a secondary where you need to do an action somewhere, you kind of need to make a sacrifice between doing damage with that unit or doing the secondary instead. And I think this is best expressed through the very close scores that we see. So yes, while the list does win, and it came pretty well placed in terms of the tournament itself, I think that the matchups show us that in some cases, the lead isn't as high as it could be if maybe there was a little bit more focus on having some of those units designed specifically to score. Maybe more warriors or more bikes, for example, or maybe just a different use of some of the models in the list. Which takes me to my next point, which isn't necessarily a weakness, but I think it's a weakness when we consider what I just mentioned about the fewer tech pieces to score, and that's that we are very heavy on Hearthguard. So there is a trade-off here. We are sacrificing the ability to include some of these cheaper units that are going to go away and die but score us points, like maybe more warriors or more bikes or more Sagittars, but what we get instead is significantly more damage, staying power, and killing potential. Let's take a moment and talk about the matchups. So game 1 was against Necrons, who were running Canoptic Court, and this was a fairly standard list, except it was quite light on Catan shards as we only had one this time. Which is, if I saw that, I'd be pretty happy. So there's only one Catan shard, it's a Void Dragon, there's Emotech the Stormlord, a couple Plasmancers, 3 Technomancers, 2 squads of Immortals, some Doomstalkers, some Scarabs for secondaries, and then we have 3 squads of 6 Canoptic Wraiths. So super durable and really annoying to deal with, except the list doesn't do all that much damage. Its priority here is to bog you down, hold you in place, while it goes around scoring and slowly picks you apart with its Nightbringers and its Doomstalkers. Keeping that context in mind, I think it makes a lot more sense as to how the pilot was able to secure such a solid lead in victory, because the Votann list here is designed to excel at damage checks. In this case, it probably isn't all that difficult to get your key units into position, especially when the rates are intentionally coming towards you, meaning we don't need to move as much, which is awesome. Like I mentioned in my last video too, we also tend to do much better into lists with large scary bricks of things because we have judgment tokens, like we see with the rates, for example, which means the damage of this list is even further amplified into these targets. For Game 2 into Eldar, the opponent was running a bunch of characters that we see here and a bunch of MSU units. So really good at scoring secondaries, really maneuverable, really quick, and every datasheet here is super efficient, especially when you have the ability to enhance a lot of them simply through Eldari's shenanigans. Now, I don't have a ton of experience playing against Eldari, especially not lists like this since the data slate, but if I had to speculate, I would say that it appears that the list that the Votann player was running simply outscales the trading pieces in the Eldari player's list. A significantly tougher matchup for sure, due to the nature of the list design and faction as a whole, but one where Corey was surely rewarded for leaning into redundant damage dealers and focusing solely on damage and primary. We don't need to worry about getting outpositioned and angled on when our goal is to be the punchback. We simply want opportunities to deliver the killing blow. And if the Eldari player, example with his swooping hawks or his warp spiders, tries to outposition us and get some cute angles on us, we actually want that to happen because we'll hurt them a lot harder than they'll hurt us. And once we do wither down whatever units that they have, we're better able to position ourselves later on the board once we've sustained the initial hits, spread out, and earn primary as appropriate. Game 3 was against a very interesting World Leaders list, so here we were running Angron with Lord and Vacatus, some Jackals, a bunch of 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound, a Lord of Skulls, and 2 Chaos Spawn for scoring and secondaries. I've said this a few times, I think Votann actually have a very favorable matchup into World Eaters, especially ones that run big blobs of Exalted, because it makes for very easy judgment targets. For instance, Angron, and in this case, the 3 Exalted 8-bounds. So what this means is that we have a list designed to do a lot of damage, we have targets that are even more vulnerable to our damage because we've judged them, and they're very easy targets. We know they're going to be running towards us, we know they're going to want to be in the thick of it, which is exactly where we want them to be, because that is where we excel with this list. And so, what happens is the inevitable clash occurs between these forces, their damage dealers, and ours, and because we've hindered them to a point of vulnerability with our judgment tokens, it is easier for us to deliver the killing blow and take these targets out. Once the World Leaders unit loses its Exalted 8-bound and Angron, he could come back, sure, but once he loses the Exalted 8-bound especially, the game is basically done. And I suspect that this happens pretty early on, just with the nature of how the army wants to play. Game 4 brings us a very interesting Chaos Demons list. Maybe it's the standard, I don't know, I haven't played against Chaos Demons in a long time. But what I see here is Be'lakor, 3 Red Masters on Blood Thrones, you have Nurglings, Plague Bearers, a bunch of Blood Crushers, some Fleshhounds, and Screamers. So what we have here ultimately is a really fast and really aggressive list, but one that built in significant tech pieces that are going to be reliant on scoring secondaries. So the list is really good at primary and really good at secondary. It's honestly really well designed. You also have a ton of damage hammers that come out here with the Blood Crushers and Be'lakor, of course. I think if I ever had to make a Demon's army for the channel, it would definitely be something like this. But anyway, a very, very close game of 71-67. I think this is the closest game we see other than the loss against 1000 Suns. And what this tells me is that the design choice here for the Chaos Demons packs enough damage spread across enough targets to actually make the Judgment Token allocation a little bit more challenging. But not only that, also deliver significant damage across all fronts. I think the damage here is probably very closely matched to that of the Votann player, except through melee format. And what's different between this list and what we see with the World Eaters is that there are simply way more targets that do a lot of damage. The Blood Crushers, for example, you got 3 big squads, you have the Ren Masters, you have Be'lakor, and then you have these really, really cheap tech pieces like the Nurglings put in place here, and the Screamers, who are going to be exceptionally powerful at scoring you secondaries, very reliably too, and holding primary if they have to hide somewhere. So without a doubt, I think this was probably one of the toughest matchups that the Votann player played against, simply because he faced a list that was able to play around a damage-dealing army. In this case, it probably would have been more beneficial if the Votann player had tech pieces himself to be able to match the tempo of the Chaos player. But it looks like he had enough damage, despite this, to slightly get a lead and come out ahead, securing the victory. I would love to hear the pilot's thoughts about this. I know he's friends with Sweet Lou, so Sweet Lou, if you're watching this, tell Corey to comment below, please, because I'd love to hear about this game. I won't spend too much time on Game 5 here when we look at the Custodies game. It's a fairly standard list. You have some scary big units, including some Custodian Guards, Custodian Wardens, and then you have the inclusion of 2 Armigers, Custos Assassin, and an Inquisitor. How do I think this game went? I think it suffers a little bit from the same problem World Eaters has, in that there are very easy judgment targets here, and the targets make up the main damage force of the army. So once you actually allocate your tokens to these units, it's going to obviously influence how your opponent plays with them. Maybe they'll be a little bit more defensive. They won't play as aggressively as they would have liked to. And if they do play aggressive with the 3-5-man Warden squads, which are going to all be judged, it means you as a Votann player with this list have the means to kill them. You'll be wounding Custodian Wardens on 2s with your Plasma, which is really good. I think the Sagittars also probably trade pretty well into Armigers here, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. Also, the Hecaton probably plays a little bit of a good role into this too. My biggest concern would be the Custos Assassin, who would obviously Vect you and make sustained hits too a little bit more expensive. But you might not actually need it, considering you're wounding the Wardens on 2 with the Plasma, so you wouldn't have to necessarily pop it there. And if you're going to pop out of your Hecaton Land Fortress with your Heart Guard and shoot with your Devs, you'll get reroll wounds, so you might not necessarily need to have sustained hits there either. You have to be a little bit more selective with your CP allocation, but overall, I think it's a pretty easy win when you consider that there are clear units here that want to be in your face, and you actually want them to come towards you because you're better at killing them. Now the last game, Game 6, into 1000 Suns. Another interesting list. We have a lot of characters, including Magnus the Red. We have a bunch of Warp Flamer, Rubric Marines. We actually have no Terminators. I think the points might have went up since the data slate came out, and there are more favorable choices now. We also have the inclusion of 2 Mutilated Vortex Beasts. These guys are pretty solid. They're going to be able to play the role of both the Hammer and the Anvil, which is quite nice, because they have some pretty decent output, surprisingly good output, and they're decently tough. They're big monster bodies, which is always good to have. You also have some really fast Zangor Enlightened, which are always good with precision, but they're predominantly here to play secondaries because they're so fast. Now, 1000 Suns usually play pretty cagey, and it's a tough army to master, but when you do, you get pretty good at dealing effective damage without putting yourself in vulnerable situations. You're able to prioritize certain targets without being vulnerable yourself, which is really good for trading, because it means most of the time your opponent doesn't get to punch back as hard as they would like to. And I think this is probably what happened here. We have Corey's list, which is built around doing as much damage as possible, and then we have the 1000 Suns list, which excels at negating that damage while also being able to safely trade. And so if I had to guess how this game went down, it's that Corey had to take a slightly different approach than what he was doing in his other matchups, because in this game, he had to be the aggressor. Now, it looks like it was a very tight game of 72-75. So Corey, if you're here, let us know in the comments how you felt this game went down, if there was something in your control that maybe you felt you could have done a little bit better, or if it really just came down to the dice rolling and it was just one unfortunate situation that happened that threw you off in the win here. I want to give another big congratulations to Corey for clutching a nice score at the Clutch City GT and making our Votann boys proud. If you want to get your minis featured on the channel, join a growing community of like-minded kin, and engage in fun Votann-based discussions, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our Discord server using the link in the description below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.